Welcome to the Teachers on Fire podcast, where I profile agents of growth and transformation in education today. Each guest shares their highs, their lows, their passions, their goals, and the resources that are shaping their thinking and inspiring their practice. For show notes and links from each episode, visit teachersonfire.net. You can also connect with the show at Teachers on Fire on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And of course, please do subscribe to the show wherever you are listening right now. I'm your host, Tim Cavey. Let's meet today's guest. Today, I am speaking with Trevor MacKenzie. Trevor is a learner, teacher, speaker, consultant, and outdoor enthusiast. He is also the author of Dive into Inquiry and a co-author of Inquiry Mindset, published by Elevate Books. Follow Trevor on Twitter at Trev_MacKenzie, Instagram at TNT MacKenzie, and at his blog at trevormackenzie.com. Trevor, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Are you ready to talk education?
Absolutely. Let's do it, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Well, this has been too long. We talked a little bit on Twitter. We're both BC residents, and we've actually been in each other's company briefly. And so now here we are finally talking, and I finally get to share your value with my audience. So I am super pumped, Trevor, about that. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit more about that local context? What does your education situation look like on a daily basis?
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate it. Yeah, so I'm from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. It's about as far west as you can get in Canada, and I teach at Oak Bay High School. I'm an English teacher, mostly senior levels, 10 through 12. And Oak Bay is a pretty diverse community. You know, we've got some really thriving programs, arts, athletics, languages, academics, a lot of community engagement. And currently also, as you mentioned, I'm an author, so I do a lot of work supporting schools and implementing inquiry. So I tend to save my international work, and it's just crazy to even talk about that. You know, I never thought becoming a teacher I would go around the world supporting schools and implementing inquiry, but I tend to save my international partnerships for spring break and summer break. And my school district here, they support me by giving me about 10 or 15 days of unpaid time to go and support schools across North America. And you and I share a really exciting opportunity here in British Columbia. We have a redesigned curriculum. So I'm working a lot with British Columbia schools, but also, you know, I was just in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Illinois, and they all have inquiry learning objectives embedded in their curriculum. So it's a fantastic time to be in education. And that's a little bit about my local context, but also a little bit of my global work as well.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the unpaid days, Trevor, because that's been a question for me. How does this guy manage it, and how does his district enable him to do everything that he does? So you've obviously made that commitment. You've made that sacrifice. And just like my last guest, Andrew Arevalo, talked about, sometimes it is worth it to give up those paid days in order to be able to share ideas and learn from others, be inspired in other contexts. And it's been a lot of fun to follow for example, your Asia tour, to see you connect with one of my former guests, Karen Caswell, and of course, so many others. Well, Trevor, we start the show at story time. So before we get into your wheelhouse, would you share with us about a low moment or an experience of adversity that you faced somewhere in your teaching or education journey, and describe how you overcame it?
Yeah, you know, I think the first kind of 5 years of my career were probably the most challenging. And, you know, if I had to kind of figure, you know, I think I've had low moments throughout my whole career, but I think those first 5 years really shaped who I am as a teacher today. And there were many forks in the road where I was questioning, do I want to commit to this? Is this something that I'm really going to see myself doing for the next 30 years? Because it was so challenging. You know, the workload, the marking load, the lack of a full-time gig. You know, I was living out of what I thought was a briefcase of substitute teaching, what felt like for years. And, you know, really I struggled with a lack of relationship, both with students and with a staff. You know, you're constantly changing schools each and every day. And then you slowly build up enough seniority that you get that contract somewhere. But even then, it's really challenging to keep all those balls in the air, you know, lesson design, unit design, let alone assessment, communicating with parents. And, you know, I love coaching. So I found the lack of being at the same school consistently, you know, didn't allow me to coach. But, I think if anything saved me throughout those first 5 years, I think it was the power of the PLN. And the PLN then is quite different than it is today. Today I have this magical network of teachers via Twitter or other social media platforms that I learn from and I connect with. And back then, the PLN was literally the staff room, going to the staff room at lunch and kind of asking questions of teachers who had been at the school for a lot longer than I had been. It was standing at my door when the bell went, and my neighbors on either side of my classroom, my colleagues, we would chat shop about what I was going to teach and what I could do to make it better, to better meet the needs of my kids. And as kids are coming in and we're saying, hi, I'm also getting this little tutorial on lesson design, if you will. And then it was also just staying after school with my colleagues and marking together and getting a better handle on the assessment side of being a teacher. So I think, those first 5 years were incredibly challenging. And I think, teachers listening, I think they would agree that the first 5 years are the hardest. If you make it past the first 5 years, I think you're going to make it as a teacher. And I'm just so thankful that they shaped how powerfully I believe in collaboration, right? Like relying on teachers in the building back then has brought me to a place now where I really do rely on my PLN to connect with, to learn from, to share ideas and bounce ideas off of. And as I said, it's just a beautiful time to be a teacher, to be so hyper connected to teachers around the world. You mentioned Karen's work over in Brisbane, Australia, just to be, so far away from one another, but be so intimately tied to what we're doing to better meet the needs of our students. So yeah, I think that undeniably the first 5 years were the hardest, and I'm just so thankful I had colleagues that I could lean on during those 5 years.
Well, I think one of the takeaways I hear there is that you did stick with it. And I guess one of the blessings, or maybe a faint silver lining of the substitute teacher circuit, is that you do see a whole lot of different contexts, right? You get a sense for what works, what doesn't, what you like, what you don't like. And I'm sure you were able to build, as you say, a few local relationships even before you started to collect the following that you have today. So that speaks to your perseverance. And I think there's something there for those teachers who are in those first 5 years and are considering leaving the profession. And that is that it really does get better. And I can't underline enough what you've said about the PLN and the role that plays. So Trevor, let's start right at your wheelhouse with Dive into Inquiry. And of course, the book that you co-authored with Rebecca Bathurst-Hunt, Inquiry Mindset, Nurturing the Dreams, Wonders, and Curiosities of Our Youngest Learners. I love how you begin both books with very human examples and case studies of disaffected learners. From where I sit, you have become the resident voice for IBL, and I don't know if anyone would dispute me on that. So for the unfamiliar, why don't you start by giving us your inquiry stump speech? What is inquiry-based learning, and why are you so passionate about moving education in this direction?
Thanks, Tim. Well, first and foremost, I never propose that teachers need to do things, quote unquote, my way. I think teaching is an art. There's incredible nuance and subtlety, and there's simply no lockstep approach, right? What makes a good teacher, nor is there like a prescriptive framework at how we should teach. But that being said, inquiry is where my heart is. It's in my bones. I think it's in my DNA. And all I could do is share with the audience here what's worked for me, what's true for me. And if that inspires anybody or resonates with anyone, I'm here to answer their questions. By all means, reach out via Twitter or my contact page on my website. I think as we know, the abundance of information at our students' fingertips, it's just intense, and it's changed so much over the course of my career, what students are bringing into the classroom with them, and not just the phones, but that prior knowledge, right? That they just are coming in with such a vast understanding of the world. And it's no longer a matter of what you know, but what you can do with what you know. And so I think inquiry really does challenge us in the classroom as teachers to facilitate experiences to help our students explore content and explore questions, and then, of course, create something that hopefully has an impact on others, whether it's a community around us or the learners around us, or even, the world, the global landscape. I think inquiry challenges students to explore, quote unquote, what I love to call ungoogleable questions, right? Those big, broad, overarching questions that hopefully, they can't just go up and ask Google when they get home to help them with their homework. They're chewing on these really big, vast, broad questions that allow us to chew on some of those close-ended questions, if you will, to allow us to get to the deeper open-ended stuff. But I think really, if content is so readily available, what are we doing with content, and how are we having our students experience something by getting to that content. And I think inquiry encourages the sharpening of competencies, whether it's collaboration or communication or creativity. And undeniably, those are competencies that are really, really necessary in today's workforce, right? We can't have students who are just, complacent in their learning. We want them to be active. We want them to be problem solvers. And for me, I've found inquiry as a framework has really been the space and the language that allows me to do kind of everything that I've just shared with you, and especially better meet the needs of students, right? Really get to the heart of who they are as human beings, what strengths they bring into the classroom, what challenges they are facing as barriers in their learning, and how could we really tailor the learning experience towards each individual student. And that's a big challenge, but that's one that's been at the forefront of my work for quite a number of years now, Tim.
For a long time, Trevor, I like to think about the 4 C's as really foundational. And we're, of course, talking about collaboration, communication, creative, and critical thinking. But I've started to use the 5 C's and adding that 5th C of curiosity. And of course, we've got Sir Ken Robinson and George Couros and others who keep that at the top of the radar. And so in my mind, isn't that one of the strengths of IBL, is that it amplifies and promotes curiosity instead of killing it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you're a father, and I have two sons, 10 years and 7 years. And both of my kids entered our educational system highly curious, right? Like just really chomping at the bit to learn, to read, to play, to interact. And, I'm a high school teacher. And so I see the opposite end of the spectrum where, students are really close to leaving our educational system. And for the most part, and this is a broad stroke, so forgive me, but for the most part, kids are entering my class a lot less curious than when they entered our educational system. And I do think that's problematic. I think there are certain things that students need to learn, of course, certain standards and even content, if you will, that is kind of a must know for every student. But at the heart of learning is curiosity, and having that burning question, that high interest piece. And maybe one day it turns into a passion or a vocation. If some students are lucky, they get to explore something in school that turns into a career. But, curiosity is at the heart of how we can better meet the needs of our learners, really hooking them in each of our classrooms. And so inquiry absolutely allows us to explore curiosity. I think a big challenge for an inquiry teacher is to look at our curriculum and have those really enticing, engaging entry points into our curriculum, speak to each student in our room. And again, that's kind of the heart of my work. How could inquiry isn't an either or. It's either we do inquiry and we don't do our curriculum, or we do our curriculum and we don't do inquiry. It's an overlapping, a laying over top each. And inquiry would be the framework that allows us to explore our curriculum through a really creative lens. And that looks like many things. It looks like many things depending on who you're teaching and what you're teaching and where you're teaching. But at the heart of it, Tim, I couldn't agree more. It's definitely a zest for curiosity, if you will.
Let's talk about the framework just a little bit more. You've expanded on it here, and obviously anyone listening who really has a serious interest in following IBL and moving into an inquiry model needs to take a look at Trevor's books. Both of them are valuable, but I think of the famous sketch note that has made the rounds on Edu Twitter. I'm sure you've shared it out, and I've certainly seen many others sharing it, and that is the one of the swimming pool, showing the different levels of guided inquiry, and they are structured, controlled, guided, all the way up to free. So I'm thinking of those teachers looking to dip their toe in the pool of inquiry, if you will. How can they get started, perhaps in their very next unit, next term, next semester? How can they take that very first step? What's a micro step into inquiry for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just a little bit of context, I've done a lot of research over the years around successful implementation of inquiry. And by and far, the research states that inquiry is really confusing because there are so many different definitions of inquiry. And,
Right.
and that in and of itself is just going to lead to chaos in the classroom, both chaos in terms of teachers collaborating to unit design, but also chaos for students. If we're talking about teaching and learning in a different way from class to class, it's going to lead to students feeling much more anxious than they need to be. So the swimming pool graphic and that analogy really allows teachers to understand the 4 types. And there's a structured end, a shallower end to the swimming pool, which kind of represents more of a teacher-directed inquiry and teacher-led inquiry. And then the deeper side of the swimming pool, the guided and the free inquiry side, side, that's much more student directed, where the teacher becomes much more of a facilitator. I work with a lot of schools long term, 2, 3, 4 years in the making. And we start out in the shallow end together. And my goal in our first year working together is that all teachers plan and implement strong, structured inquiry units so that as a culture of learning in the school, our students are all hearing the same language and they're seeing a similar framework, so that when they start to take on more agency over learning, they not only feel more confident, but more specifically, they have the skills and understandings necessary to be successful with that type of agency over learning. So for the listeners at home, I'd encourage you to start in the shallow end, of course, and start with a unit of study that you've perhaps already taught or already designed, and you're going to implement it maybe again in the next couple weeks or months. And I'd encourage you to frame your unit of study in that big overarching ungoogleable question, and make that question like front and center in your classroom. It should be something that all of your students can see and speak to at any time. And that way, as you're going through the research and you're unpacking resources and students are grappling with content, they're making connections to that big overarching ungoogleable question. And there are a lot of elements embedded in an inquiry unit. Provocations, that's one I mentioned earlier, those really rich, engaging entry points into those questions. What we choose as an engaging provocation and how we roll that out and how we get students to engage with that provocation will lead to kind of side paths, if you will, where students go down a bit of a rabbit hole, but it's always tied back to that big overarching question. And also that structured side allows the teacher to choose the product, the summative piece. And so it really is a teacher-directed inquiry. It allows teachers to feel that inquiry isn't super nebulous or uncertain. It's something that they can take on and they can be successful in. And then slowly we begin to add in those other types over time. And some teachers are ready a lot sooner than others. They want to get going on the controlled inquiry and the guided and even the free. But I'd always encourage teachers not to go to the deep end first. I was guilty of that as well early in my career. The free side can be so inspiring when students are doing something where they're highly passionate about and curious in. But without those skills and understandings, those competencies that we're referring to, students will feel overwhelmed, and their well-being has to be at the heart of what we do and what we plan for. And so I encourage listeners to start with the structured side. At my website, trevormackenzie.com, we have a bunch of free resources, and one resource we have is a structured unit planning template where you can just look at your unit design that you already have planned and backfill it into this template. And then there are going to be some areas that you're going to have to kind of hash out and reframe based on what the template is calling for you to do. But in a nutshell, Google that, that swimming pool analogy. You'll find it right away. Print it off. I use it in my classroom as a teaching tool. I refer to it often in learning to give my students direction and agency over learning. And I encourage listeners to start in the structured side, the shallow end, Tim.
Now, you mentioned summative assessment, Trevor, and that's where I wanted to go next, because I feel like some of the first pushback that I know you must hear is from educators who have concerns around assessment. They feel that inquiry learning somehow makes things more slippery and less rigorous, perhaps, or whatever, just more uncertain in general. And so I have a feeling that you're going to push back on that and talk about how IBL actually improves the quality and maybe the frequency of feedback for students. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and letting the cat out of the bag here, I'm currently writing a third book, and really it's going to focus on assessment in my classroom and how I assess with an inquiry lens. And that's not going to be out for about 6 months to 8 months. But, and I speak to that because the book is a result of the questions that I'm answering in my consulting and in my working with schools. And so I just want to remove that barrier for teachers who are really interested in implementing inquiry. And that's, the push, my inspiration for this third book is to better meet the needs of teachers out there. So, I think assessment was always something early in my career I used to take home with me. Quite frankly, I used to pack up, assignments and put them in my English teacher kind of briefcase and take them home. And I give my students all this really rich formative feedback, and I give them a mark, and then I'd come in the next day and I'd ask them to read the feedback. And of course, teachers around the world know this to be true. They never look at the feedback. They turn directly to the number. And then rather than look at the feedback after the number, they turn to their friend beside them and they say, "Hey, what's your number?" And it really, what I learned over time is what I was doing was really promoting and nurturing a sad, tragic comparative culture in assessment, where rather than look at your own learning, you are comparing your learning against others. And it was really having a negative impact on how my students were seeing themselves, right? They were seeing themselves defined by the number I gave them and what their friends got on an assignment. And so slowly what I started to do was have assessment be something that I did in class, and no longer would it be something that I take home with me. Assessment has to be a verb. It has to be something, an action that we do together. And all assignments can't be done this way, but the vast majority of the assignments I do are done in class. And that looks like many things. And that's not a teaser to wait for the book, but it really does. It looks like many things. It looks like, one really amazing hack was I just refused to put numbers on assignments anymore. I put them in my grade book, and everything that a student sees on assignment in my class, it's all formative. It's all feedback. And I asked them to spend maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes at most, reading the feedback and looking at our co-designed rubric, whatever that assessment tool is that we've built out together. And I asked them to figure out the number. If my feedback is on point and it's rich and clear and it's aligned with the co-designed assessment tool, my students should be able to get the exact number I have in my grade book, right? And in that, they're not turning to the number, they're not turning to their friend next door, they're turning to what is best for their learning, what I've suggested could improve their learning, what I've suggested they've done really well. And then they come up after that 10 or 15 minutes and they tell me the number that they feel I've written in my gradebook, or the feedback has told them they have. And so really just tweaking some of the things that I've always valued in assessment, but really having them be embedded in student voice. And, at the end of the year, if my students aren't leaving with a clear understanding of who they are as learners and as people, then I feel like I've done them a disservice. And I always felt like I was really strong in my assessment practice. Like I know all my kids and I know what they need to do next and how to get them to that next point. But my students didn't know that. And that is my fault in how I spend time in class and how I embed their voice in our assessment practice, how I make assessment a verb. And that's really forced me to rethink how I want to spend time with kids. Maybe I don't spend 3 weeks or 6 weeks unpacking Shakespeare, but maybe within those 6 weeks, I spend a little bit less time unpacking the content and I have assessment infuse that content so that the content is much more meaningful and relevant to the kids, because hand in hand, they're getting to know themselves better as learners. So, your question's a big one, Tim. I think we can have a series of podcasts on assessment alone. And I think, in a nutshell, assessment has become something that it has to happen in my class with my students so that they know themselves better. And in that inquiry in and of itself is a personalized learning pathway. And if assessment isn't personalized, then we truly aren't doing powerful, sustained, authentic inquiry. We're just doing something that at the end of the day, the teacher is assessing. And so we really want to flip that a little bit. And when I say flip that a little bit, it's all about a balance. I never suggest that we are in free inquiry, the deep side of the pool where it's student agency maximum 100% of the time. That's just not realistic. I do propose that there's always a balance between the teacher directed and the student centered, and that's the same for our assessment. There's some assessments I need to take home and spend some time unpacking because perhaps I'm the assessment expert with that piece, and a lot of the stuff, the vast majority, I really do believe that it could be done in class with students, if you will.
I think assessment experts around the world are applauding. I think of my friend Aaron Blackwelder at Teachers Going Gradeless and so many others who are absolutely loving what you just had to share there. I wanted to ask you about a tweet that you sent out a year ago that basically broke EduTwitter. At this point, you've already spoken to it, so I just want to read it. You tweeted, "I just spent the last 2 days writing my report cards with my students. I asked them about their strengths. I asked them to share a future learning goal. We looked at their body of work and we selected a grade together. Why haven't I been doing this my entire career?" And that got about 7,000 likes. And that was a year ago. So I can only imagine what it's at this point. I will make sure to embed the tweet in the show notes. But to me, that just speaks to the power of conferencing to solve some of these lingering questions around the role of assessment in IBL, and at the same time give our students just such a tremendous sense of ownership and agency in the assessment process. And so I don't know, is there anything more that we need to add to that power of the conference?
Well, I think what seems like a really nebulous or kind of, gray area way in terms of assessing with students ended up being really practical and really helpful both for me and the students. Literally I opened up my grade book on my computer and as we were conferencing, I was scribing their words and their thoughts directly into the report card. And then I would read back what they shared and ask them for approval. And the response in the subsequent weeks was just mind blowing. I think this was the greatest impact for me in that students actually went home and advocated. They begged their parents to read their report card. And at the high school level, like that never happens, right? Like sometimes report cards don't even make it home, let alone return to school when teacher or parents are supposed to sign them, right? But kids were going home and they were tapping their parents on the shoulder saying, "Can you read that comment and can you look at that grade?" And the parent would say, "Well, why?" And they said, "Because I actually co-wrote that," or "That's a grade that I had a voice in choosing." And that could be really, troublesome for some teachers. What does that look like? And what does that sound like? And how do parents feel about that? How do students feel about that? And I just beg of you to hold tight. Feel free to answer or send me any questions that you have, but hold tight for that next book, because that's really where I explain, all the challenges I've faced in this process I've gone through with kids and with parents, as well as how I've overcome those challenges and how I've made it work for me. And at the end of the day, again, I really want my students to leave their time with me understanding themselves better and understanding that they're more than a number or letter grade on a page. Because of course, in 20 years, those letter grades and those numbers, they don't define who these people grow into.
Meaningless.
And sadly, it's meaningless. And sadly, though, at the high school level, and we see it slowly begin to creep up as our students go through our elementary school, slowly they see these numbers and these letter grades as being a part of their identity. And they slowly start to see themselves as, well, I'm a D student or I'm not a math student. And that's just heartbreaking. Like my 10-year-old, he's exceptionally curious. He's like really, really unique. He's really into, unique things. And I want that to be honored. I don't want that to be squelched. Like I want a teacher to see him and recognize those really cool things about my son and honor them. And I'm so fortunate that for the listeners who have been a part of my children's journey and education, they've all done an amazing job. They are expert teachers who are really, at the forefront of meeting the needs of my children in the schools here in British Columbia. So I've got no qualms or no worries that my kids are in great hands. But I think across the world, this is something that we need to be focusing on is how can we make sure that our kids are feeling good about themselves and feeling good about learning, but of course being stretched and challenged through some rigor so they can leave us better than when they came in terms of having skills and competencies sharpened, if you will.
I love that connection you made with the fixed mindset. And I'll tell you, Mindset by Carol Dweck, and I read that book in my VIU program, by the way, and that really led to the launch of this podcast. And I can't underline enough what you just said about the role that traditional assessment plays in defining who we are and who we are not. And that's such a tragedy when that takes place, I think. One more question, Trevor. I've got to sneak this one in. Why aren't schools and jurisdictions building their professional development around the IBL model? In the words of Mike Washburn over at On Education, most Pro-D sucks. So that's the way he puts it. So we feel this push. Even my last guest, Andrew Revelo, is making a push for personalized Pro-D. Why aren't we bringing this out more? We know there are ed camps around, but we aren't seeing much of them yet. So what are your thoughts? I'm sure this has crossed your mind.
Yeah, wow, that's a loaded question. I love that you've teed me up with that one. I think sadly PD for teachers sometimes more often than not, it's not designed by teachers. It's designed by administrators or people at a leadership level. And really, when you attend PD that's designed by teachers in the classroom, I think you experience something that's really applicable. It's really relevant and achievable. It's full of those rich takeaways that can be implemented in the classroom right away. And sure, there's some theory there, but teachers know that we need something where the rubber hits the road. We need something that's going to impact our kids right away. And sadly, if you're not having a teacher at the table planning that PD, then I think a lot of that experience tends to be overlooked. And so, my events where I go and I support a school, or, I was just in Pennsylvania and it was amazing. It was 350 teachers, every middle school and high school teacher in the district. This was the first time in the history of the district where all those teachers were doing a single day of learning together. And it was a day where they experienced inquiry. It wasn't sit and get for 7 or 8 hours. It was, they were moving, they were collaborating, they were building out things together. And that's exactly how I want them to go back and implement this in their classroom, where they're not just at the front of the room with 30 kids. They're getting their kids to take on that ownership and that heavy lifting and that building out of something. And so I think, part of the answer to your question and that challenge that we're seeing around the world is we need teachers taking some agency over their PD. And I say this in anytime I speak on the topic, if we're talking student agency, that has to go hand in hand with teacher agency. And I see some amazing authors, consultants, educators doing amazing things with having it be highly relevant and hands-on. But I think sadly, if it's not facilitated or planned by a teacher at that planning table,
exactly,
right away I think there's a disconnect between what is applicable and achievable and relevant and timely, something that we can take back to our classroom literally on the Monday after that PD, right? It has to be something we can do. And I think that's something that's missing in the global PD kind of landscape. And again, that's a broad stroke. I see some amazing things, some amazing teachers doing great things with PD, but definitely it's not the norm. It's more the outlier, if you will.
Well, I should clarify and say I get amped up for professional development. I am one of those learning geeks, and I definitely will also say from firsthand experience that Trevor definitely models the pedagogy and practices that he preaches. He walks the walk. But yeah, I think there is definitely some room, and I hear you agreeing with that we need to make sure that teachers have a voice in the process. Well, let's move outside of inquiry. Trevor, we could, as you said, go all day on that. But as you look across your PLN and your own practice, is there something else that is setting you on fire about education today?
Yeah, I've gone down a really meaningful, relevant, kind of personal rabbit hole, if you will, into cultural responsiveness, unpacking racism and how it's kind of systemically embedded in what we teach and how we assess, looking at allyship, and allyship not as a destination, but more of a process. Like, I'm always trying to figure out how I can be an ally to teachers and educators and parents and learners that aren't the white Caucasian self that I am when I walk into my classroom. And so that's been something, exploring identity, unpacking my own biases in front of my kids, in front of my students. And that could be really, really demonstrating some vulnerability and some honesty. But what I'm trying to do is gently help them understand their own identity and in turn understand kind of society's hand and what we value and how we treat one another. And so that's been kind of, looking beyond my classroom, something that I'm definitely on fire over. Educators that I admire that are part of this conversation that is inspiring me. I'm a big fan of Gary Gray Jr. If you don't know Gary Gray, he's kind of an international teacher. He's currently in Manila. He's a Canadian from the East Coast, but I love what he's speaking about. Liz Kleinrock is another one. I'm a big fan of hers, and not just with regards to unpacking racism, but really looking at identity and the language we use when we're talking about who we are and what we call ourselves. And I love Cornelius Minor. He's another one. And those are just a few educators that have me really fired up on that topic. And I think that, that goes hand in hand with inquiry to kind of loop back to what we've been talking about the whole time. If I want my students to truly understand themselves as learners and as people, as human beings, as they leave our educational systems, I want them to understand all those influences. And sometimes there are biases or barriers trying to keep them compartmentalized. And if we can understand those systems, I think we can kind of free ourselves of those systems, if you will. And that's a bold statement, but like, come on, why are we in education if we're not trying to change, how our young people see themselves and the world around them, right? So yeah, Gary Gray Jr., Liz Kleinrock, Cornelius Minor, those would be three teachers that I think teachers that are listening should go find and follow if they're not already.
Amazing stuff. Well, Trevor, congratulations on recently completing your master's degree. I know that was a long journey for you, and it must have been sort of a constant burden in the background with everything else you're involved in. You've already shared that kind of your next big professional goal is the publication of your next book, and we look forward to that. Outside of education, what's another area of learning for you? What is it that ignites your passions? when you leave the classroom and the education space and brings you alive as a human being?
I love teaching teachers and I love teaching students, right? And so I'm trying to find the balance between both, being in the classroom and visiting these schools around the world. In the next 10 months, I'll be, oh goodness, Luxembourg, Holland, London, Stockholm, South Africa, Hong Kong. It's just these schools around the world that are really a part of this global conversation around moving from that over standardized curriculum towards a more personalized one. And so for me, it's, how can I continue to do both, teach teachers, but also teach students. And when I'm in the classroom with my kids, really being responsive to the needs that I'm facing in my classroom, like really being in the moment and being present. And I think there are so many things in our schools that distract us from being present, right? Whether it's the dozens and dozens of emails we get in our inbox, whether it's announcements or checking our mailbox in the office, there are all these things that kind of if we let them, can distract us from just being present with our kids. And so I think those are a few professional goals for me. How can I continue to do both and do both really well? And then when I'm in the classroom with my students, just really being in the moment and not trying to do things too fast, really slowing down and being as present as I can be. And that sounds really nebulous, but I think, the most powerful teachers that I've seen do what they do, they're just so, agile in how they do it, right? They tend to see the landscape in their room and they tend to go to places that maybe they didn't anticipate that they'd go to. And in that, it's an incredible responsiveness that I really I hold dear in my practice, and it's something that I definitely try to enter my classroom with each and every day. Is how can I just be present and mindful of what's happening before me?
Such an important message. Now, thinking about learning and passions outside of education, Trevor, you mentioned that you're an outdoor enthusiast. Over here on the mainland, I'm big into paddleboarding and hiking. What does that look like for you?
I'm an avid cyclist. So, I'm up early and I'm on the bike out the door, and I tend to get home before my kids are awake. So that kind of is a little bit of a lens into how early I wake up in the morning. But yeah, I love being on the road. I race bikes, and I have a strong community of guys that we race bikes with. And that's kind of a little bit of the competitiveness in me, if you will, but also that need for, community and collaboration. As I mentioned at the onset of the podcast, I really love being a part of something greater than myself, whether it's a school community, a class community, or on the bike with a group of guys. So definitely cycling's what gets me going and fired up and keeps me healthy and sharp, right? And I think if we're not taking care of ourselves, we certainly aren't doing our best for taking care of others. So definitely got to feed myself first in the day, and then I'm kind of set for taking on the challenges that we face in the classroom throughout the rest of the day.
Well, you can't pick a better place in the world to do that road biking with mountains on one side and ocean on the other. So that does not surprise me. And then finally, before we get into your quick picks, Trevor, share about a personal habit or a productivity hack that contributes to your success. You just talked about being present in the moment. Is there an app or a daily routine that really helps you get it all done?
Yeah, listen, I'm a 5 a.m. guy, even earlier on some days. And I value that hour and a half to maybe 2.5 hours before, the family's awake and before the world's awake. I listened to this one author years ago talk about her routine to writing novels. And she used to get up at 3 in the morning, and she spoke about how the world was just still. There was no current, no electricity. It was just quiet. And that's where her artistic kind of height came in throughout the day. And for me, getting up at 5 a.m., it's having a cup of coffee. It's, getting down to some of the planning for the day and looking at the checklist of what I want to accomplish that day, and maybe firing off a few of those logistical pieces, whether it's emails or, tweets or reading an article that I've been meaning to read for a number of days. But then sometimes it's getting some writing done. And again, with productivity and being a father and a teacher and a consultant, I don't have days and days and days where I could just sit down and write. What a lavish lifestyle that would be. I'm big on kind of these 2-hour windows of productivity, right? And if I could sit down and get an hour and a half to 2 hours, and 2 hours is my max. Like, I can't sit still for longer than 2 hours. I don't know how our students do it. And so I tend to get a lot done at 5 a.m. and the occasional kind of afternoon session, whether it's after school or on a weekend. But that 5 a.m. is kind of probably the greatest addition to, my lifestyle, both in terms of being active and healthy, but also being productive, that I've adopted throughout the course of my teaching career.
That's music to my ears, and it makes me think of a book called Miracle Morning for for writers, and that one was suggested by Lynn-Mara Colon, another guest of the program. So if you are digging Trevor's morning routine, make sure you keep that book in mind. Well, just before we continue, I do want to share an important message from the Teach Better team. Are you looking to reach more students, innovate your instruction, and teach better? Then join the Teach Better team on November 8th and 9th in Northeast Ohio for the first ever Teach Better conference. Join dynamic educators such as Dave Burgess, Tal Thompson, Adam Welcome, and more. Register now at teachbetterconference.com. And when you do, be sure to use discount code FIRE50 to save $50 on either of the 2-day registration options. Are you ready to be better? Well, all right, Trevor, it's time for your quick picks. And here we want to know the education voices and resources that are shaping your practice and inspiring your thinking today. So I know this first one is a tough one for those that have such a large following as you do, but starting at Twitter, tell us about someone we need to follow there and share why they've been inspiring you lately.
Yeah, that is a really tough one, but I have to talk about the Merrills EDU. That's at the Merrills EDU, and this is a married couple, Joe and Kristen. They're out of Florida. They're both elementary school teachers, and I'm just so in awe of the stuff that they do in their classroom with their littles. Joe just tweeted out something today about him doing a little green screen math activity where he draped this green, t-shirt over his face, but then he put his glasses over top of the sheet, and it made him look like a ghost, right? And so he did this whole math lesson, that he recorded, and it was like the students were interacting with a ghost through these recordings, and that sounds pretty novel, but it's really engaging when you're talking about a 6-year-old, 7-year-old grappling with a boring math concept that typically is taught via a worksheet or drill and kill. This is Joe Merrill doing something really kind of funny and humane and interactive. So the Merrills EDU, they're doing some crazy cool stuff, and I really geek out on their Twitter account and their Instagram account for sure.
Point us to an edtech tool or an app that you currently love using in your classroom or somewhere else in your professional practice.
Yeah, this is an easy one. I am a huge FlipGrid fan. I will kind of follow them wherever they go, and really because they've impacted my assessment practice so dramatically the last couple of years. I love that they've gone free and it's an equitable platform for all young people. Any user around the world can access FlipGrid unlimited for free, but it's just made such a big shift in terms of my students' confidence, how they share voice in the classroom, and there's such a vibrant community there. So I love sharing my love for FlipGrid, and that would be definitely the edtech tool that I'd like to share with this audience. Yeah.
Recommend one book, maybe one that you've been reading lately, or one of your all-time faves that really shaped your thinking, and tell us why you recommend it.
Yeah, you mentioned, Carol Dweck's mindset. I think that's a huge one. I think, Innovator's mindset. I love George's work and talking about how we see our students and how we see ourselves and interacting with them. I think, oh goodness, that's such a hard question. I'm a big fan of Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins' work around understanding by design and essential questions. I love Dan Rothstein and Lou Santana, Make Just One Change and the question formulation technique. And then, I love trading books with other authors around the world that I meet. And so, it's this lovely little book club where I'll send them my books and they'll send me theirs. So I'm always reading something. Those are a few that I've read in the last couple of years or that have shaped some sharpening of my educational practice, if you will.
Trevor, I have no idea if you are a podcast listener, but if you are, tell us about one that you've been enjoying lately and maybe why we need to subscribe.
Yeah, well, I'm a little late to the game, so don't judge me, but I'm really breezing through Serial. It's that real crime narrative. And, when I travel, when I'm on a plane, I love that one. And I also am a big fan of that white fragility. I just think that's so powerful. So those are two that I've been eating up the episodes as of late.
Okay. And again, I don't know if you're a YouTuber, but tell us about a YouTube channel that you enjoy and why we need to subscribe.
Yeah, Gary Gray Jr. Gary Gray, again, I referenced him in what I'm really digging right now in education and cultural responsiveness. And Gary is an amazing videographer. He creates these amazing little tutorials that really just show you how he talks about identity and culture in the classroom. And I could just spend time, as much time as I can looking at Gary's channel. And Gary's a busy guy. He's a full-time teacher. So when he does post something, I'm just really happy to go check it out and see what he's chewing on with his students.
The last one, Trevor, is just for fun. What are you watching on Netflix these days?
Yeah, again, I'm so busy that no judgment from the audience that I'm only getting to this now. But again, I've breezed through the series. I'm on the last few episodes of Stranger Things. I'm just totally loving it. And the last couple of weeks, I breezed through season 1 and season 2, and I've got a couple more episodes in season 3, and definitely loving Stranger Things right now.
Now, I know your crew at home is a little on the young side. Can they handle Stranger Things or no?
No, not yet. You know, my eldest, he's 10, and his big interest right now is World War II
Wow.
and World War II history. So we actually watch some World War II documentaries together on Netflix. And then my youngest, my 7-year-old, as all you Canadians know, and our Americans are kind of angry with us, if you will, my youngest, he's got Raptor fever. You know, the Raptors
Sure.
had such a successful run in the playoffs that it really created a lifelong player, I think. And so in the morning, you know, I'm watching World War II documentaries on one TV, and then I go and check in on my 7-year-old, and he's watching, you know, plays of the week or highlights from the night before from the Raptors. So it's a beautiful thing being a parent, right? I used to think that, you know, my kids are so unique and different, and we raise them the same and we fed them the same, but we don't. We really are. You parent differently depending on who your little people are, and if they demonstrate a passion or they're really curious about something, you tend to stoke that and you nurture that. And you know, I begin to talk about my kids in a different light, in that, you know, we are responsive to who they are, and there's some base values and beliefs we have in our household, but really, you know, I think that they're incredibly different kids because we parent them differently, as we should with our students. You should teach differently depending on who your kids are, right?
Trevor, this has been absolutely amazing. You've brought full value in all of the, and I've put a lot of questions to you, sir. So thank you so much. What are the best ways for the listeners to follow you and connect with inquiry-based learning and find out more?
Yeah, I'm really active on Twitter at Trev_MacKenzie. And with that, you know, we've got 2 hashtags, hashtag dive into inquiry and hashtag inquiry mindset. And there's a community of teachers around the world who are contributing to those hashtags, you know, what it looks like in their classroom and what they're doing and questions that they have. And if you're at all ever, you know, questioning inquiry, or you want to connect with teachers out there, just tag me in a tweet. And that's just, you know, a little bit of a subtle message for me to retweet you and connect you with my community that, you know, I've nurtured. So by all means, find me there. I love Instagram. You know, you'll see a lens into my day-to-day life as well as my teaching and what I'm passionate about, what's got me ticking, and that's at TNT MacKenzie. And then my website, trevormackенzie.com. You know, a bunch of free resources. I love blogging. I love sharing what's happening in my travels and my classroom. And yeah, definitely those are the 3 most active spaces for me, Twitter, Instagram, and my website.
That sounds great, Trevor. Thank you so much again for sharing your time with the podcast today. This has been a conversation I've been looking forward to for quite some time, and I'm so glad that we finally connected. You are such an important voice, in my view, in the education space, and continue to bring about the change and start those hard conversations around education districts across the world, really, and continue that great work. I can't wait to see what's coming our way in terms of assessment. That's another such a critical conversation. Thank you again, Trevor, and have a great school year.
Thanks, Tim. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Before we sign off today, I'd like to share some highlights from around the Teachers on Fire community this week. The first stop is on Twitter, where Dr. Christine Ho Younghusband at ChristineYH tweets about her recent walk through her city of Prince George. And she also mentions that she, quote, listened to at Teachers on Fire during my walk, episodes 104 and 105 with Dr. Will and Miss Ott. Loved it. And she also tags Kylo_Rain. Thank you for that, Christine. Next, my last guest, Andrew Arevalo at Gameboy Drew, tweeted, everything I do is for my community. In this episode, I share the vision I have for lifting my stakeholders, the obstacles I've faced, and how I'm inspiring my students to chase their dreams. Thank you for having me at Teachers on Fire. And he also tweeted, quote, you are doing incredible things with your podcast, friend. Thank you for allowing me to share my voice. Really, you don't know how much that means to me. My mom and dad both listened. Well, that last part probably means the most. I really like the idea that Andrew's parents both listened. And if you did hear the episode, you know that Andrew shouted out his dad, Greg Arevalo, for his amazing career that I think is still well underway. And he is much loved by his community there in Southern California. So thank you for a tremendous legacy of education, and I love what it is bringing about in your family, Greg Arevalo. Awesome. Next on Twitter, Julia Fliss at Julia Fliss tweeted, quote, "Wow, your commitment to community, growth, reflection, innovation, putting yourself out there, and the importance of re-envisioning ourselves as resources on the planet, legacy is one of the most inspiring and authentic testaments to education I've heard. Thanks for the uplift." And Julia, of course, is also referring to the episode I published with Andrew Revelo. Next up on Twitter, Sarah Thomas at Sarah the Teacher tweets, "Many thanks, Tim. I loved your episode with Dan. Listen to that this morning." Next, Kelly Christofferson at Kelly W. Chris tweeted, "Learning isn't always about the new. By revisiting something and approaching it from a different path or with a different mindset, we can see what might be. Every day is a PD day. Hashtag MyPD today." And Dr. Kelly Christofferson, or I think the doctorate may be underway, is researching social media and its uses in our PLNs. And of course, I just completed a master's study on the very same things, so I love that connection. And I agree, podcasting is the new PD. And if you are listening to this podcast, you probably agree too. Next up on Twitter, Janet Fasnacht at JMFASSNACHT, and I'm probably butchering your last name, so apologies, Jeanette. She tweeted, "Terrific episode from one of my favorite podcasts. Thank you at Teachers on Fire, at Gameboy Drew, hashtag 40CFPLN." And that's a reference to the 4 o'clock faculty, which I believe is another great education podcast. Next up, boss_teach at GIBSOALE tweeted in reference to my last episode with Andrew Revelo. "This will get me through the week, traveling to work and back now." Triple exclamation marks. So someone was very excited to listen to Andrew Revelo, and he is, again, one of the nicest guys you'll meet in education. Brian Carpenter at Brian Carr tweeted, "At Gameboy Drew shares his presenter origin story, taking a pay hit to grow his PLN and inspires teachers. He's on his way to affecting change in his hometown and beyond. Listen to him on at Teachers on Fire, episode 106, hashtag fresh air at 5, cool 2 degrees air. Now ready for Monday. Hashtag balance LAP." And then later, Brian also tweeted, "Listen up, PLN. At Gameboy Drew has a great message. He's on his way." At Teachers on Fire. Well, thank you for the kind words, Brian. Brian's been a faithful supporter of the show. And if you are interested in those early mornings, get up with Brian at 5 o'clock, wherever you are in whatever time zone you may find yourself, and go for a walk, listen to some podcast PD, and join in with Brian at the hashtag fresh air at 5. Next, Janelle McLaughlin, also a former guest of the show, at MS_Mac4 tweeted, "I'm only halfway through this at Teachers on Fire podcast with at Gameboy Drew. OMG, loving the Future City project, Andrew. So exciting. I want to talk to you more about this and some other things I've already heard in the interview." Well, to all of the people I've mentioned here, thank you so much for the encouragement. And if you have read, replied, liked, or retweeted my content on Twitter, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Podcasting is my passion, and it feels incredible to know that listeners are finding value in what I'm sharing. You truly are the fuel to my fire. I will also invite you to check out the Teachers on Fire magazine on Medium, where this week we featured a story by Tammy Breitweiser at TLBREIT on Twitter called "How Far Back Do Books Go For You?" Tammy talks about the connections between our earliest reading experiences and our reading and learning as adults, and she gets into a little bit of an anecdote about her very first Scholastic book fair, which brings back memories for many of us, I think. Next, Caitlin Giordano at Mrs_Giordano on Twitter wrote, "Skill-specific writing conferences." Caitlin is really combining two areas of keen interest for me, and those are grading conferences and writing feedback. Caitlin is a master in both of these spaces, so make sure you give that article a look. Well, if you're wondering, well, how do I find the Teachers on Fire magazine? It's a Medium publication, and you'll find it over on medium.com or on the Medium app. If you're already an education blogger, consider joining our growing writing team there. You can continue to publish content on your own blog, and you keep full credit and ownership of your content on Medium. Message me at Teachers on Fire on any social media platform for more details. Well, Teachers on Fire, I will leave you with this quote from my reading. It comes from a book called Professionally Driven, Empower Every Educator to Redefine PD by Jared Borman. And you'll find him on Twitter at jborman. That's JBORMANN3. And he writes, Thomas Guskey reminds us that the sole purpose of professional development is to have a positive effect on learner outcomes. So my question for you, administrators and education leaders, is this. Is your professional development having direct and positive effects on learner outcomes? If we can't answer a firm yes to that question, maybe we need to rethink how we are designing and constructing our professional development opportunities. And again, I'm excited about this medium and other mediums and the way professional development may be changing and evolving. It's a slow-moving ship. Takes time to turn it around, but I think we are getting better at our professional development, and Trevor touched on that in this conversation. Well, again, I'm your host, Tim Cavey, and I'm so grateful that you decided to spend some of your day listening to this podcast. I hope that in some way the content you heard today from Trevor MacKenzie ignited your thinking and inspired your practice. And I'll meet you next week right here on the Teachers on Fire podcast. Take care and have a great week.